India's coronavirus hotspot. Through drones, police scan the city. We can see if you come out of your homes, they announce. In the alleys of Mumbai's slums, health workers are trying to go to each one-room house, screening people for symptoms. This city has the highest number of COVID cases and deaths in India. But those on the front lines say the reality is far more grim than what statistics show. I spoke to a doctor at a Mumbai state-run hospital. He didn't want to be identified, fearing reprisal from the government.
Yes, we are under testing, under reporting. So the other day, 6 patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, they were brought in dead. We didn't even test them, even though there was a very high suspicion that they might have had COVID. Now, even the relatives were not tested. One of the reasons why we're not testing deceased patients is there is a global shortage of the number of kits. So you want to use your kits very wisely.
It's not just here in Mumbai. Doctors in different parts of the country have told me that people with underlying conditions are often not enumerated as COVID deaths. The other problem is India's testing rate, among the lowest in the world, which means there's no clear picture yet of how bad it is here. A doctor from southern India described what she's been seeing. She too didn't want to be identified.
From my own eyes, they're not testing people. They're just not testing them. There's so many people who are coming with symptoms. They're going to go out and spread it to other people. We don't know how many people are affected by it. We are not ready for it, and there is no way we can contain it. And I'm really scared personally as a doctor.
India's health ministry didn't respond to the BBC's questions about official COVID numbers. The worst might still be some way off, but already nerves are frayed. Resources are falling short. We have to wait hours for patients to be admitted, these paramedics in Delhi told us. For weeks, India has been in lockdown, which is now set to go on until the 3rd of May. In many parts of the country, it's being strictly enforced. And is believed to have reduced the burden on hospitals to some extent. But experts say without ramping up testing, no nation can hope to beat the virus.
More sick people will keep coming and coming and coming until you have an extensive testing and isolation strategy. Or you can just stay on lockdown for long periods of time. But staying on lockdown for India has massive costs, especially for the poor.
Each day is hard for those left without jobs, money, food or shelter. Aid is reaching some of them, but there are questions about how long it can be sustained. Yogita Lamai, BBC News, Mumbai.
Usually the spring break holiday would see California's beaches packed, but this state was the first to order its residents to stay at home, an early lockdown that seems to be paying off. A place with twice the population of New York has had a fraction of the deaths, hundreds rather than thousands, and a governor unveiling a plan for a long road back to normal.
It will not be a permanent state. We recognize the consequences of these stay-at-home orders have a profound impact on the economy, your personal household budget, your personal prospects around your future.
But governors like him face an unlikely opponent. Donald Trump, meeting survivors of the coronavirus at the White House, has already claimed only he has ultimate power to reopen the country.
When somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be. The authority is total. It's total.
The governors and the Constitution disagree.
I mean, it's just a factual statement that is factually wrong. 10th Amendment to the Constitution. There's a whole body of case law.
There are lessons in the lockdown from the West Coast, where Silicon Valley giants like Apple told staff to work from home days before government orders.
When I started writing about this 3.5 weeks ago, the number of cases in San Francisco and the number of cases in New York were essentially the same.
Doctors saw the number of cases fall dramatically. The next phase could be harder.
The last month or 2 months has been brutally hard, but amazingly easy in terms of messaging. The next phase, I think, has to be far more nuanced because we don't have a vaccine, we don't have effective treatments. There's nothing about the virus that has changed in terms of its deadliness.
But even here, there are dissenters. There's police video showing 150 people arriving at an underground nightclub for 2 days of secret partying. It's now been shut down. Whatever the authorities say, they need the public to do as they're told. Greg Milam, Sky News, Los Angeles.
Everybody knows what's going on there. American taxpayers provide between $400 million and $500 million per year to the WHO. In contrast, China contributes roughly $40 million a year and even less. As the organization's leading sponsor, the United States has a duty to insist on full accountability. One of the most dangerous and costly decisions from the WHO was its disastrous decision to oppose travel restrictions from China and other nations. They were very much opposed to what we did. Fortunately, I was not convinced and suspended travel from China, saving untold numbers of lives. Thousands and thousands of people would have died. Had other nations likewise suspended travel from China, countless more lives would have been saved. Instead, look at the rest of the world, look at parts of Europe. Other nations and regions who followed WHO guidelines and kept their borders open to China accelerated the pandemic all around the world. Many countries said, we're going to listen to the WHO, and they have problems the likes of which they cannot believe. Nobody can believe. The decision of other major countries to keep travel open was one of the great tragedies and missed opportunities from the early days. The WHO's attack on travel restrictions put political correctness above life-saving measures. Travel bans work for the same reason that quarantines work. Pandemics depend on human-to-human transmission. Border control is fundamental to virus control. Since its establishment in 1948, the American people have generously supported the World Health Organization to provide better health outcomes for the world and, most importantly, to help prevent global health crises. With the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have deep concerns whether America's generosity has been put to the best use possible. The reality is that the WHO failed to adequately obtain, vet, and share information in a timely and transparent fashion. The world depends on the WHO to work with countries to ensure that accurate information about international health threats is shared in a timely manner. And if it's not, to independently tell the world the truth about what is happening. The WHO failed in this basic duty and must be held accountable. It's time, after all of these decades. The WHO failed to investigate credible reports from sources in Wuhan that conflicted directly with the Chinese government's official accounts. There was credible information to suspect human-to-human transmission in December 2019, which should have spurred the WHO to investigate and investigate immediately. Through the middle of January, it parroted and publicly endorsed the idea that there was not human-to-human transmission happening, despite reports and clear evidence to the contrary. The delays the WHO experienced in declaring a public health emergency cost valuable time, tremendous amounts of time. More time was lost in the delay it took to get a team of international experts in to examine the outbreak, which we wanted to do, which they should have done. The inability of the WHO to obtain virus samples to this date has deprived the scientific community of essential data. New data that emerges across the world on a daily basis points to the unreliability of the initial reports, and the world received all sorts of false information about transmission and mortality. The silence of the WHO on the disappearance of scientific researchers and doctors, and on new restrictions on the sharing of research into the origins of COVID-19 in the country of origin is deeply concerning, especially when we put up by far the largest amount of money. Not even close. Had the WHO done its job to get medical experts into China to objectively assess the situation on the ground and to call out China's lack of transparency, the outbreak could have been contained at its source with very little death.
The U.S. Annually contributes about $400 million, $500 million to the World Health Organization. But today the president announced the United States is halting funding because the World Health Organization was too pro-China, must be held accountable. I want to put up on the screen, John, as we continue to discuss this, a tweet that the president himself posted back on January 24th. Watch this. Look at this. China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well. In particular, on behalf of the American people, I wanted to thank President Xi. That's what the president said on January 24th. That's in a statement from the president on Twitter. And now he's blaming the World Health Organization for being too supportive of China in those initial days.
And Wolf, you can go back through the president's Twitter feed, and I urge any Trump supporters watching to do so because he tells you not to trust us. So do this yourself. Go back through the president's Twitter feed in those early days. He not only repeatedly praises President Xi, he on several occasions praises the World Health Organization, saying it was working with the United States to try to get to the bottom of this. That being said, again, the president's criticisms of the World Health Organization are quite legitimate. It was flat-footed here. Again, CNN called this a pandemic before the World Health Organization. But this is an attempt by the president to steer you away from his own actions. On January 22nd, he did an interview with CNBC. He was asked, do you think this will be a pandemic? He said, no. And he said that was because he thought President Xi was on top of it. He has several times since says he believes China is professionally handling this and praised President Xi. And just think for a second, Wolf, I could go on and cite many, many examples of this, but just think for a second. Yes, the World Health Organization has a lot of questions to answer about its believing China, about its being slow to call this a pandemic. That is a fact, and the president is right about that. But who do you think has the best intelligence about what is happening in China? The World Health Organization or the world's greatest nation?
With all the talk tonight about lifting social distancing guidelines state by state, there's an eye-opening new study from a team of researchers at Harvard School of Public Health. It predicts under certain scenarios the potential need for those measures and school closures to continue until 2022. In our next segment, we'll be joined by someone working to brighten that picture considerably. She leads the vaccine effort at the National Institutes of Health. But first, Yonatan Grad, Assistant Professor of Immunology and Infectious Diseases at Harvard University School of Public Health. Thanks so much for being with us, Professor Grad. Your team used models of what we now know about COVID-19, along with other viruses, to create possible scenarios of the pandemic, one which concluded a potential need for social distancing until 2022. Can you explain how you found that?
Absolutely. So there are two ways in which the pandemic ends. One, we eliminate the virus. I think with global spread of the virus, that one is quite unlikely. In the second, pandemic ends because there's sufficient immunity in the population. So with that as a backdrop, we were interested in asking about the impact of social distancing and what happens when we stop a one-time effort. So we are doing social distancing with the idea of flattening the curve and trying to prevent overwhelming our healthcare infrastructure. If we're successful in doing that, we also keep a lot of people susceptible to the infection so that if we stop social distancing after 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, or what have you, there will still be a pool of people who are susceptible, and we might see, again, a rise in infection, which might prompt us to reinitiate social distancing. So keeping in mind that our goal is getting up to population-level immunity in the absence of a vaccine or potentially other types of interventions, what we might see is this kind of on-off intermittent distancing. And to get up to population immunity, again, that end point, would take until 2022.
And that's predicated on the belief that once you have been infected, you would develop an immunity. Is that correct? Because I mean, I know that hasn't been proven conclusively.
That is correct. We are in this model assuming that infection brings along with it sufficient immune protection to last at least that duration.
So the idea of 2022, that's just how, I mean, you got that date really just by projecting out when enough people would develop what they call herd immunity.
That's right. So what we took as an approach to this is keeping in mind that we're flattening the curve to try to reduce the pressure on the healthcare infrastructure. That what we want to do is institute these social distancing measures when it looks like, when we project that we would start to approach what the critical care infrastructure is, that kind of the maximum there, and then we could turn it off as we're starting to see the curve go down. Again, we have this kind of thermostat model where we would titrate to, again, trying to maintain our healthcare infrastructure. When we use that as our goal, we end up projecting these multiple rounds of social distancing that takes us out to 2022.
So when you say multiple rounds, what does the social distancing look like? Is it sort of the current system of stay at home, schools are closed 6 feet apart, wear masks outside? Or there are varieties of it, depending on the circumstances?
In the scenarios that we modeled, we used very effective social distancing. So that would be the kind of whole hog effort that we're seeing now. It's certainly worth exploring the impact of alternatives or using other approaches or introducing new interventions, increasing the critical care capacity of our hospitals, developing new therapeutics that are very effective, putting into place contact tracing, quarantine, and isolation. All of those could change those scenarios. Similarly, if we learn that there are particular parts of the population that are more infected than we had been aware, that there's a greater spread of the disease in the population, so there is already much more immunity, that would also change these scenarios.
Well, it's really fascinating. Professor Grad, I appreciate all you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you? I'm Dr. Katz. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
What's your name?
Suzelle Smith.
Suzelle Smith. Okay, fantastic. We're going to do a COVID-19 test on you. It's a nasal swab, okay?
Right.
It's just before daybreak in Southern California, and Dr. Dan Katz isn't letting the rain slow him down.
Bear with me here, okay?
Donned head to toe in PPE, he and his team are conducting test after test for residents here who fear they may have COVID-19.
I'm done.
That's it. We'll call you with the result. Take care.
And you're going to do 150 of these today?
150 today, 150 tomorrow, and 150 on Wednesday.
They have the tests, and the tests are beautiful. Anybody that needs a test gets a test.
More than 5 weeks since this promise, widespread rapid testing for the coronavirus still remains patchwork at best. In a country of over 328 million people, only around 3 million have been tested. And as the country continues to struggle with the outbreak, it's becoming increasingly evident that testing for both the virus and its antibodies may be a key component to fully reopening the country. Yet much about the long-term effects of testing is still to be known, and for some Americans, it's too little, too late. Samantha Northard of New York began feeling sick on March 22nd.
It's a pain throughout my body that I've never had with any other type of flu.
Samantha knew she'd been in contact with someone who had tested positive. After 5 days of symptoms and registering with the health department, she reached out to her doctor's office to find out about getting tested there.
Talked to them, explained my timeline, explained my symptoms. The nurse spoke with the doctor and came back and said, "So, we're calling you a presumptive positive. Sorry, there's no access to testing right now. Please don't go to the hospital unless you're having trouble breathing."
By day 9, Samantha's symptoms worsened. She called the health department a second time to try to get a test.
April 1st was the day that I legitimately almost went to the hospital. The gentleman I spoke to said, you have all these trigger things that should have escalated you to the front with a positive case, having all the symptoms, timeline of isolation. You probably should have heard from somebody by now.
But her efforts, futile. She was never able to obtain a test.
It's really scary to know that you are the person who has something that could potentially kill somebody else.
Even frontline workers are having trouble getting reliable rapid tests.
As far as testing is concerned, I don't think we're catching up.
In New York City, the epicenter of the country's outbreak, testing for the city's fire department is woefully inadequate, according to Gerard Fitzgerald, president of the Uniformed Firefighters Association.
Still to this day, we're over a month into this now, and we still have no ability to get rapid testing with rapid results.
The urgency to fix our testing system coming against the background of more and more calls to reopen the country. Today, President Trump said that his administration will put forth a plan to do just that in the coming days.
That's what we want. We want to have our country open. We want to return to normal life. Our country's going to be open, and it's going to be successfully opened.
But experts warn that rushing things without mass testing could undo the recent gains that are successfully flattening the curve. Dr. Patrice Harris is the president of the American Medical Association.
The foundation of any informed choices or policy decisions going forward is science and the evidence. And one critical piece of this is testing capacity.
She says since the beginning of the crisis, the United States has been playing catch-up in terms of testing.
We certainly have been behind regarding testing capacity. So we really need an all-hands-on-deck effort to get the testing supplies that we need to build up the testing capacity that we require.
In contrast, South Korea is starting to return to normal, thanks in part to mass testing and intensive contact tracing, which helped contain the virus. Only 217 people have died of COVID-19 there out of over 10,500 confirmed cases. The government program has become the gold standard worldwide. Korea is now sending 600,000 of their state-of-the-art rapid tests to the United States at the request of President Trump, expected here tomorrow. The lack of national testing has forced states and private companies to fill the gap.
I'm getting ready to see the patient, so I have to wear my equipment. Everything is in the car.
Dr. Iman Bar is a concierge doctor in Southern California who says her schedule is now jammed with COVID-19 house calls.
So if you can keep that, like the mask on your mouth, but not on your nose.
Over the weekend, Dr. Barr and teams from local labs were busy administering tests to these Manhattan Beach first responders, conducting both the nasal swab to detect those currently infected and the antibody test to see who has immunity.
What role do you think you're playing right now in getting people like these guys back to work?
So I see myself as a provider that serves in the community to be able to make sure that nobody's spreading the infection as well.
If you learn that you do have the antibodies, will that give you a sense of confidence?
I think it will just at least make me more reassured when I'm around. You know, I have young kids at home, and both my wife and I work, so we rely on them and also a daycare to watch our kids. So it gives me some sense with that because they are, in the at-risk population.
Everybody's at home, huh?
No, pretty much quiet shifts. There's a concern that because you are on the front lines, you are responsible and some of these guys might be spreading it.
We know the risk that we take when we come to work. It's a new experience for us to take that risk home to our families.
Getting people tested on a large scale has not been easy here or pretty much anywhere.
Here in Los Angeles, like so many places, we were just left on our own. There was no tests that were being delivered from the federal government. So we had to step up and figure this out ourselves.
LA's mayor, Eric Garcetti, is calling on the public to do more than just adhere to social distancing.
Well, you already have delegated testing in the city.
Yeah, it's been remarkable to see citizens step up.
Citizens like Sean Penn.
It is a new kind of wake-up call. It's got to be all hands on deck.
Well, I just want to thank you
The actor turned activist's nonprofit named CORE focuses on communities in crisis. Founded back in 2010, the group supports disaster relief around the world. But now their focus is Penn's home state of California, operating COVID-19 test sites. Working with the LA Mayor's office and fire department, Penn and his team are training volunteers to run those drive-through facilities, responsibility that often has fallen on first responders.
We thought we can help here.
When I first spoke to Penn and CORE's CEO Ann Lee about 2 weeks ago, they had just opened their first testing site.
Safety is our #1 concern. We have so much training right now. It is our biggest area of focus.
We have about a 6-foot hot zone limit for our volunteers. They're in full PPE. They are describing through the window of the car what to do. The closest that they ever get is on the handoff through the window of the kit. Then they observe the kit being used, making sure that the people understand how to use it. All these are the CORE volunteers.
This weekend, when we visited them in West Los Angeles, they were up to 6 locations.
We should be on pace to have done 100,000 tests by first week May.
Wow.
And hopefully, hoping to expand far beyond that as we go along, as long as it has to be done.
It's a concept that Penn believes is scalable.
You be home and be happy, okay?
And is the idea to basically have an army of volunteers like this administering tests across the country, maybe not by CORE, but by replicating this with other NGOs?
Yeah, that's the dream goal.
At this rate, the good work of volunteers may be our best shot for one of the most important pieces of this puzzle.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.
President Trump still has not answered one key question from yesterday's marathon White House briefing. The president used the briefing in part to air a propaganda video made by the White House, which heralded the president's actions to combat the pandemic and was a also blatant attempt to rewrite weeks of inaction and the president downplaying the threat of the pandemic. But one CBS News reporter noted that the propaganda video conveniently left out most of one key month.
The entire
January, I said in January.
The video has a complete gap.
On January 30th.
What did your administration do in February with the time that your travel ban thought?
A lot. And in fact, we'll give you a list. What we did, in fact, part of it was up there. We did a lot.
The omission from the propaganda video may be because President Trump and his team do not want you to remember what he said and did in February, such as this.
By April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away.
The coronavirus, which is very well under control in our country. We have very few people with it. The people are getting better. They're all getting better.
Again, when you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to 0, that's a pretty good job we've done.
More than 600,000 cases, more than 25,000 dead. It's now April. The virus is nowhere close to disappearing. We should also note the president also held 4 rallies in February, thousands of people in enclosed spaces. CNN's Caitlin Collins picks this story up from the White House.
Amid the pandemic, President Trump is stoking his feud with state governors about when to reopen the country, a decision that he says is all his.
When somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total.
After some Democratic governors pushed back on his assertion, Trump tweeted that someone should tell those governors Mutiny on the Bounty was one of his favorite movies.
Let any one of you provoke an incident.
A good old-fashioned mutiny every now and then is an exciting and invigorating thing to watch, Trump tweeted, especially when the mutineers need so much from the captain. Constitutional experts say the president's claim has no basis in reality, and Trump isn't saying who told him that it did.
You said when someone is president of the United States, their authority is total. That is not true.
Okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to write up papers on this. It's not going to be necessary. because the governors need us one way or the other, because ultimately it comes with the federal government. I haven't asked anybody because I don't, you know why? Because I don't have to. Go ahead, please.
But who told you the president has the total authority?
Enough.
Two of Trump's Republican allies also say he's wrong. Senator Rand Paul and Congresswoman Liz Cheney posted these tweets saying the federal government does not have absolute power, though they didn't mention the president.
You're so disgraceful.
The coronavirus briefing at the White House Monday quickly turned into an aggressive defense of Trump's leadership. Angered by an extensive report in the New York Times that documented his slow response to the outbreak, Trump dimmed the lights and played a highly edited campaign-style video outlining what the administration had done.
Well, we've asked them to accelerate whatever they're doing in terms of a vaccine.
But the video largely glossed over the month of February and highlighted no steps Trump took then to slow the spread.
I said in January.
The video has a complete gap.
On January 30th.
What did your administration do in February with the time that your travel ban
A
bought you?
lot,
What?
a lot. And in fact, we'll give you a list. What we did, in fact, part of it was up there. We did a lot. Look. You know you're a fake. You know that.
In February, the president did continue to hold campaign rallies and often downplayed the threat of coronavirus in the U.S.
You know, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true.
As he now focuses on the economy, Trump says he'll announce a second task force focused on reopening the country today, though it's still not clear who is on it or what exactly it will do.
The president, I think, is moving towards some very important announcements in the next day or two.
Now, Jake, it's still incredibly fluid exactly what this task force is going to look like. The president says there's also going to be others dedicated to manufacturing, religion, things of that nature, though it's not clear when we're going to hear about those. But as of this morning, we are still being told that this task force is going to be announced today, so we should get a better look of who's on it and what exactly the president expects it to do.
All right, and we're still waiting for that list from the White House of steps that the president and the White House took in February to help slow the spread of the coronavirus. Thank you so much, Caitlin Collins. The city of Philadelphia today announced that it has topped 7,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus in the city. To date, in the city of brotherly love, 206 people have died from COVID-19. Joining me now is the mayor of Philadelphia, Jim Kenney. Mr. Mayor, good to see you again. Last Wednesday, Vice President Pence said that Philadelphia was, quote, an area of particular concern. State health officials say that Philly could be near or at your peak of coronavirus cases. What are the conditions like in Philadelphia right now?
Well, as you said, over 7,000 positive cases and over 200 people succumbed. We're holding our own. I mean, you know firsthand, we have the best hospitals in the world, some of the best hospitals in the world, and they're not at full capacity yet. There's enough ICU beds, there's enough ventilators, and there's enough regular bed capacity. We've set up a surge hospital at the terrific Temple University. It's been wonderful to us, and we have that ready to go. We have not accepted a patient there yet. We expect it to be staffed by Thursday and potentially taking patients that are not as sick, who are stepping down into that facility to free up room for the people who are sicker.
Mr. Mayor, do the healthcare workers in Philadelphia have all of the protective gear, all of the ventilators that you need in case you see a greater surge?
We have a capacity of ventilators now. We're working on the purchase of a hybrid ventilator that was developed at MIT and Jefferson University, and we're in the process of concluding the purchase of those to have them on standby. The PPE has really been frustrating because it's something that the federal government could have really helped us with, but we're scrounging and begging and borrowing and stealing. We're working, the hospital workers have it. We're working, the thing they're running out of a lot are the surgical gowns, and we're trying to help them get those. And now we're concentrating on the nursing homes, which are seeing devastation in our, I think we have 64 nursing homes in Philadelphia, and every nursing home has at least one or more people that are infected. And most of our deaths have been people over the age of 70, people with pre-existing health conditions, and people in nursing homes.
Mr. Mayor, you've said that one of your biggest concerns is that Philadelphians think it's safe and go out and try to resume normal activities as they were doing in January. And you warned that if they do that too quickly and not following guidance, that could lead to a resurgence of the disease. Are you seeing indications that Philadelphians are doing that, or that's just a worry?
I think the majority of Philadelphians are doing it. I understand how hard it is to stay in your house for a month or more, and even more than that, possibly. But people are venturing out. We're trying to get them to exercise or ride their bike with, the distance that's needed to keep them safe. We ask them to just go out and do the things that they need to do, the grocery store, the doctor, and people for the most part are complying. But again, our big fear is that we're getting mixed messages from Washington, and I don't want people using what the White House says to say, well, it's over now, so we can go out and resume our activities. We're in close connection with Governor Wolf in Harrisburg, and he's of the same mindset we are. We should go by the science and the medicine and take our advice from those sectors. The economy, of course, is a concern for us. I'm fearful as to what we're going to face when we start winding this down from a city budget perspective, but it's better than losing people's lives. And if we can get it, the curve is starting to flatten. If we can get it down to a point where we feel safe to resume, we just don't want to resume too early where people will wind up getting killed or dying from it.
You wrote a letter to Congress asking for more federal help other than the personal protective equipment and the surgical gowns that you referred to. What exactly does Philadelphia need in terms of help from the federal government?
We need direct funding. We love our state governments, but we need money directly to cities so that we could utilize them without any type of loss of money or handling charges or anything like that. We need the money straight to us. And the PPE equipment, as you said, but our housing needs are really serious. We have a lot of people facing eviction, although the eviction courts are closed and they're not executing any writs. People are getting behind in their mortgage, getting behind in their rent. We've served 1 million meals plus since this started. We've set up 80 sites in our schools to feed our kids, because a lot of our kids live in poverty and they depend on going to school to get their meals and get their health care. So we're continuing that. We have 40 sites set up for families with larger boxes of food, and they're open on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And we're doing the best to get our homeless population tested and in shelter. And when you live in a city that's as wonderful as our city, but has a large poor population, our challenges are even greater.
President,
Go ahead,
Mr. President, Mr. President, you were just criticizing the WHO for praising China as transparent, but you were saying many of the same things about China just a couple of months ago. So, how do you square your decision to...
Well, I did a trade deal with China, where China's supposed to be spending $250 billion in our country. We're going to be watching very much to see. Now, we got a little bit waylaid by the virus. But look, I'd love to have a good relationship with China. But if you look, and we made a phenomenal deal. China has paid, because of me, China has paid us tens of billions of dollars over the course of a very short period of time. Billions of it. Some of that money has been spent to farmers where they were targeted by China. We cannot let that happen. We can't let that happen. So we ended up signing a very good trade deal. Now I want to see if China lives up to it. I know President Xi. I think he will live up to it. If he doesn't live up to it, that will be okay too, because we have very, very good alternatives.
Mr. President.
Go ahead.
Mr. President.
Thank you. Today, 600,000 cases, 25,000 deaths. I know you want to blame the WHO, but I've spoken to hundreds of people across the country in the last few weeks who say they still can't get tested, and that they aren't social distancing because
so
they...
the governors, Excuse me. I know your question. You ready? The governors are supposed to do testing. It's up to the governors. Go ahead, please.
Mr. President,
go ahead, please.
Just get back.
Quiet.
If we could just get back to May 1.
They are not.
Mr. President,
they are following your lead. That they are not social distancing.
The governors are doing the testing. It's now not up, and it hasn't been up to the federal government. Go ahead.
Mr. President, I have a quick follow on the WHO, but if May 1...
I told them when they put this guy here, it's nothing but trouble. He's a showboat. If you keep talking, I'll leave, and you can have it out with the rest of these people. If you keep talking, I'm going to leave, and you can have it out with them. Just a loudmouth. Go ahead.
If you could kind of clarify, are you basically lifting your slow the spread before the May 1 deadline?
No, I'm not at all.
How many
The governors are going to be running their individual states. Some of them will say, no, I can't open now. And some of them may last longer than we even would think. Others will say, I can. You can go. I don't want to mention states, but there are numerous states that are in great shape right now. They're viewing the rest of the country like, we don't even believe this is happening. We have a lot of those states. They're set to open practically now. I mean, they would be open now. We're going to let them open sooner than the date. We're going to pick a date. We're going to get a date that's good, but it's going to be very, very soon, sooner than the end of the month. But there are many states out there that are looking at this and they're reviewing it and they're saying, we shouldn't be even included in this. You know, there are some that want to open up almost now. Now, if we disagree with it, we're not going to let them open. We're not going to let them open. If some governor said, you know, has a lot of problems, a lot of cases, a lot of death, and they want to open early, we're not going to let it happen. So we're there to watch. We're there to help. But we're also there to be critics. And on testing, very important, we've always wanted the states to do the testing. We're now providing great testing, but the state has to provide the great testing. The state has to provide the ventilators, but they didn't do that. So we ended up going into the ventilator business, essentially, and we've made tens of thousands of ventilators, and we solved a big problem for the states. But we want them to do the testing, and we are there to help. Yeah, please.
I have two questions, or I have a question on the
One
governor.
question, just one.
Well, I have a question on the governors, but first, can I follow up on Jordan's
One question. Go
Can
ahead.
I follow up on Jordan's question? Do
Go
you
ahead.
want to walk back where you did praise China in January for being transparent about the
I'm always
coronavirus?
respectful of China. I'm respectful of other countries. Why wouldn't I be respectful of China? In the meantime, China's paid us nothing in your last administration, nothing in any previous administration. They paid us tens of billions of dollars because of what we've done. And the trade deal we have, they have to give us $250 billion in purchases. Let's see if they do that. And they're also paying us 25% or $250 billion in tariffs. So we're taking in, wait a minute, we're taking in billions of dollars for China. From China, they never paid us 10 cents. That's a great thing. Now, if they don't produce or if we find out bad things, we're not going to be happy. But right now, and we're doing that. That's what we're doing. Look, we have an investigation underway. We're paying almost $500 million. We have an investigation underway on the World Health Organization. We will find out exactly what went on. And we may be satisfied that it could be remedied, and we may be satisfied that it's so bad that it can't be remedied. And if it can't, we're going to go a different route.
My question, you're criticizing the WHO for praising China for being transparent, but you also praise China for being transparent.
I don't talk about China's transparency.
January,
Well, you know, if I'm so good to China, how come I was the only person, the only leader of a country that closed our borders tightly against China? And by the way, when I closed our border, that was long ahead of what anybody, you can ask anybody that was in the room, 21 people. I was the one person that wanted to do it. Deborah can tell you that better than anybody. I was the one person that wanted to do it. You know why? Because I don't believe everything I hear. And I closed. And if we didn't close our border early, very early, long before the kind of dates you're talking about, we would have had thousands and probably hundreds of thousands more deaths. Please.
Do you have any evidence the virus began in a Chinese lab and maybe was released accidentally?
There's a lot of rumor and speculation in a wide variety of media, the blog sites, etc. It should be no surprise to you that we've taken a keen interest in that, and we've had a lot of intelligence take a hard look at that. And I would just say at this point, it's inconclusive, although the weight of evidence seems to indicate natural. But we don't know for certain.
Rush hour reshaped by coronavirus. In Pittsburgh, bumper-to-bumper traffic for miles, not to get to work, but to get food.
I just got laid off. I'm just a single parent. There's nobody but me.
5,000 carloads served by the Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank in recent weeks. Drop-ins at the organization's warehouse up 500%.
In all honesty, and this is not an easy thing as a food banker to say, we know that in this particular crisis, that the demand is greater than even our organization can meet.
Scenes playing out coast to coast as millions of American families find themselves unexpectedly unemployed and suddenly food insecure. In New York City, soup kitchen lines doubling. Volunteers in LA can't fill bags fast enough. And in St. Louis, traffic cops brought in to direct cars waiting not just for meals, but also diapers.
Almost every parent, right, who has to come and ask for diapers, you can feel this and see this just like visceral fear and worry.
The St. Louis Diaper Bank usually distributes 200,000 diapers per month. This April, it'll be 500,000.
You know, we maybe have enough to get through the next week, but then we're going to have to start to get creative about how we're going to access those diapers.
The pandemic putting unprecedented pressure on American families and the organizations that serve them. Sarah Dolph, NBC News.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
An operation to disinfect the city of Herat is in full swing. A task force has been sent out to clean the streets, hospitals, and government buildings to counter the spread of coronavirus. The western Afghan city is the epicenter of the outbreak. The first cases were linked to people returning from neighboring Iran. Health officials are scrambling to prevent a rapid spread of the virus.
Our biggest worry now is not the virus coming from Iran, but rather an increase in community infections in Herat province. The virus is spreading fast among families. We're not able at this stage to track all those infected people, but so far 30% of those tested came up positive.
In a country where family connections are strong, the authorities are struggling to convince people self-isolate. Abdulrahman is among the millions of low-wage workers badly affected by the restrictions imposed by the authorities to contain the pandemic. After years of war, Afghanistan faces many challenges: instability, poverty, and a declining economy.
From the last 27 days, I was not able to go out to the marketplace to sell watermelons because of the lockdown. Now we are running out of crucial food items at home, such as flour, rice, and beans.
Abdurrahman's wife tested positive for COVID-19 a few weeks ago. Fatima was treated in a local hospital and she has since recovered. We met her the moment she was released from the hospital.
After my admission to this hospital, doctors gave me medicine and also injections. After a few days, they took blood samples and the test came out negative. They asked me how I felt. I told them I was feeling very good. Now I'm going home.
As the virus spreads fast, thousands of Afghan refugees have returned from Iran and Pakistan in recent weeks. In Herat, officials say they are taking all necessary measures to contain the pandemic.
We have stocked enough food items so we can help 400,000 people. Our goal is to ensure enough food reserves for as long as the lockdown continues. We are also working on improving health facilities.
But for a country seeking to heal the scars of war, the pandemic poses more challenges to a government that's already struggling with shortage of ventilators, masks, and hand sanitizers. Hashim Ahbara, Al Jazeera.
I don't think $536 is free. I don't know. I'm a grad student, and that's literally 2 weeks worth of my paycheck.
2 weeks of pay for a coronavirus test, the one that's supposed to be free anywhere in America, by law, passed by Congress last month as our economy was shutting down. Even earlier, many states had ordered free testing, and some large insurance companies had pledged no costs. But in West Virginia, Anna Davis Abel got a bill anyway. She filmed herself going through a drive-through testing site.
Oh my God, they just pulled my braid out through my nostril, but it's done. I am now tested for COVID-19.
When the bill came, it wasn't for the COVID-19 test itself, but for a whole battery of other tests for things like the flu and adenovirus. With tests in short supply, her doctor had to rule out other things first before she could get a COVID-19 test.
The long and the short of it is, the only reason that you had these tests done was because your doctor was concerned that you might have coronavirus and they had to do these tests first in order to get you a coronavirus test, and yet still you got billed more than $500 for it.
Yes, if I had not met my deductible or if I had been paying out of pocket, it would have been $2,000.
Aetna's parent company, CVS Health, had pledged to waive copays for all diagnostic testing related to COVID-19. But Anna's doctor told her those initial tests couldn't be billed under the COVID-19 billing code. After NBC News contacted Aetna, the insurer followed up to say it was waiving Anna's costs retroactively. An Aetna spokesman saying that hers was an unusual instance and that our commitment to waiving member costs for testing and treatment related to COVID-19 has not changed. Most people we spoke to did not get charged for a COVID-19 test. And if you've ever been in a U.S. hospital, you know that medical billing is extremely complicated. So maybe those surprise bills that some Americans are getting aren't that surprising.
It is now the law that insurance is supposed to cover that test 100%. And then if you're uninsured, there are different pathways to get to a free test, although you're going to have to sign up for something.
But what happens though if you go in because you're having symptoms or concerns you need a coronavirus test? They evaluate you for things like the flu and they determine you don't need a coronavirus test.
Right. So then you might get charged for the visit. The law is kind of narrowly written.
So they tested me for the coronavirus. After that, I started feeling quite a bit better while I was waiting on the results. But anyhow, then 2 weeks later, I get a bill in the mail for $857 for lab work. The actual test was $1,143, and my insurance discount got it down to $857. And I had not met my deductible, so I owed $857. My first thought was, they made a mistake.
No mistake. Just like Anna, Ricky got hit with a bill for an upper respiratory panel his doctor ordered before giving him the COVID-19 test. Blue Cross Blue Shield had pledged to cover full testing costs for COVID-19. But a spokesman tells me members can still be charged for other tests their doctor orders. Blue Cross says it's prepared to make changes as necessary to ensure cost isn't a barrier.
My immediate response was anger.
By the time Melanie Yazzie came down with symptoms, New Mexico had already ordered testing free.
So I drove to the other side of town and I waited for 3 hours and then I got tested and I drove off and came back home. And I actually got the bill before I got the results of my test.
Almost $200. In Yazzie's case, it seems the billing office sent her the bill that should have gone to her insurance company. They're supposedly working it out.
I still have no idea if my insurance paid for this $199 or if the state paid for it or how this is being offered for free.
And the most important question, what happened with your test? Hopefully it was negative.
It was negative. Yeah, it was negative. I received results maybe 5 days later, and I breathed a sigh of relief.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
Hi, everybody. Let me start by saying the obvious. These aren't normal times. As we all manage our way through a pandemic unlike anything we've seen in a century, Michelle and I hope that you and your families are safe and well. Over the past weeks, we've seen plenty of examples of the kind of courage, kindness, and selflessness that we're going to need to get through one of the most difficult times in our history. Michelle and I have been amazed at the incredible bravery of our medical professionals who are putting their lives on the line to save others, the public servants and health officials battling this disease, the workers taking risks every day to keep our economy running, and everyone who's making their own sacrifice at home with their families, all for the greater good. But if there's one thing we've learned as a country from moments of great crisis, it's that the spirit of looking out for one another can't be restricted to our homes or our workplaces or our neighborhoods or our houses of worship. It also has to be reflected in our national government. The kind of leadership that's guided by knowledge and experience, honesty and humility, empathy and grace. That kind of leadership doesn't just belong in our state capitals and mayor's offices. It belongs in the White House, in a president right now. Joe helped me manage H1N1 and prevent the Ebola epidemic from becoming the type of pandemic we're seeing now. He helped me restore America's standing and leadership in the world on the other threats of our time, like nuclear proliferation and climate change. Joe has the character and the experience to guide us through one of our darkest times and heal us through a long recovery.
And let's just bring you the latest figures that are coming from the Department of Health for the UK's overall figures for coronavirus. We've had all the individual countries have announced their numbers in the last couple of hours. But now the Department of Health saying that as of this morning, 382,650 tests have been carried out, 14,982 the day before. Of those tests, 93,000 have tested positive. So of the around 300,000 or so tests that have been carried out, 93,000 tested positive. And of those hospitalised in the UK, now overall 12,107 have sadly died. That's an increase of 778 from yesterday. The majority of those in England, but that is now the number gone up by 778 overall across the whole of the UK because of COVID-19. The total now 12,107.
The latest official evidence of the human cost of coronavirus shows a very sharp rise in the number of deaths per week throughout England and Wales, 6,000 more than would be expected at this time of year. The figures released by the ONS, that's the Office for National Statistics, relate to the week leading up to the 3rd of April, since when the numbers have risen again, and there is particular concern about the situation in care homes and in the community at large. Now, the new figures show that more than 1 in 5 deaths in England and Wales are now linked to coronavirus. Across the UK, there were 778 deaths reported in the last 24-hour period, most of those in hospitals. And it means that so far, the official number of deaths in the UK linked to coronavirus is more than 12,000. But it's important to note that that number doesn't include deaths in care homes or in the community in England or in Northern Ireland. Now, the impact of the crisis on the economy is also causing concern. An independent report says that a 3-month lockdown could cause the economy to shrink by as much as 13% this year. More on the economy in a moment, but first, our health editor, Hugh Pym, on the latest figures.
My mum, she was my best friend. She was kind, funny.
Candice remembers her mother Anne, who died with COVID-19. She last saw Anne when she was in an ambulance on the way to hospital, where she died 11 days ago.
I'm never going to see my mum again, and I'd rather not see the outside again than never spend, like, my mum was only 58 and it just wasn't her time. This is just the worst pain in the world, and I just think it's just not worth it. It's just not going outside and meeting up with your friends.
A tragic loss, and there are many others suffered by families every day. And now new statistics reveal there are more than we thought. Until very recently, all the focus on coronavirus deaths has been on those in hospitals. That's where the daily data comes from. But the latest set of stats shines some light on the spread of the virus in local communities and deaths there, which might be directly or indirectly linked to COVID-19. Weekly deaths in England and Wales were at the highest since records began in 2005, according to the Office for National Statistics. In the week ending April the 3rd, there were more than 16,300 deaths. That's around 6,000 more than the average for this time of year. Coronavirus cases contributed much of the jump, linked to nearly 3,500. But it's not clear what's behind the rest. Possibly some could be caused by people not seeking treatment for other conditions.
It is possible that there are further deaths that relate to coronavirus that haven't been recorded as that. It is possible that there are further deaths that relate to other conditions for which people perhaps have not accessed help in the way that they might have done in the past.
The head of NHS England, after a big drop in A&E visits last month, has urged patients not to stay away from hospitals.
If you're a parent and you're worried about your child, if you're concerned about maybe having a heart attack or a stroke, any other essential need, please come forward, access the NHS. Our staff are here to look after you.
Sir Simon, who revealed he himself had had coronavirus and self-isolated for just over a week, was meeting student nurses and doctors who volunteered for frontline work.
Is it a bit daunting when you think about it?
Yeah, it is. It is daunting because obviously I have family, I have friends that I care about, and my health too as well. But it's an important time for everyone to be part of it.
Boosting testing of patients and NHS staff wanting to return to work is an urgent priority, and the government set an ambitious target of 100,000 a day by the end of this month, up from about 15,000 now. And the big pharmaceutical companies say they can help.
We'll be fully operational at the end of the month, beginning of May, and by then I think that lab's going to be contributing around 30,000 of the target. And obviously we're delighted to participate. We've got many of our scientists who are very engaged in that and keen to support that aspect of solutions.
But supplies of personal protective equipment are still tight, and there's been an urgent appeal to businesses to produce whatever they can for frontline staff to help save lives for the carers as well as the patients they look after. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, one of the most troubling elements of the new data from the ONS is that around 1 in 10 of all deaths linked to coronavirus happened outside hospital, including at least 217 in care homes, and those figures are already some 11 days out of date. The charity Age UK has warned that COVID-19 is spreading in care homes like wildfire. The government says it wants to speed up reporting of deaths in care homes. It's already confirmed that there have been outbreaks of COVID-19 in more than 2,000 homes in England, as our correspondent Alex Forsyth explains now.
My mum was a people's person. She told everyone she loved them and everyone loved her.
Rose Mitchell was a familiar face on her street in southwest London.
To Rose.
So much so, her neighbours stood outside to pay their respects on hearing that she'd died. At 81, she passed away in her care home after contracting coronavirus. Her daughter and the rest of her family on the end of the phone.
They held the phone to her ear. We could hear her just breathing. And we played her Danny Boy, her favourite song. And we all told her we loved her and said goodbye.
Karen says what's happening in care homes can't be overlooked, praising carers like those who were with her mum until the end.
I can only say to them, thank you, because over the last week that has brought us incredible comfort to know that she wasn't alone.
Care homes across the country are reporting a rising number of deaths. Here in Liverpool, 15 residents. A further 13 people at this home in County Durham. And here, near Bristol, a significant number are said to have died. At Philia Lodge in Peterborough, 16 out of 18 residents have shown symptoms and 6 have lost their lives. Carers there when family can't be.
For now, Grandma, this is goodbye. But I know that you will always be with us in our hearts and that you've helped make so full of love and happy memories for us to treasure forever. Good night and sleep well.
At this home not far from Wolverhampton, staff are frightened. Impossible to keep their distance from each other. These carers say they're on the forgotten front line.
It's just scary because they said it's got to get worse. So when you keep thinking of what's the next shift going to be like, what's going to happen on this shift, and we're going to...
It's mentally and physically draining.
Yeah.
The staff are all quite worried because when we have ambulances come in, that they've all got the full-on gear on, and where we haven't got a lot of PPE, you feel vulnerable.
Yeah, it's worrying as well, because we're going back to our loved ones as well.
The government says it is delivering millions of items of protective kit and increasing testing capacity, but managers here say it's not enough.
They're not testing. We're not testing. We've had residents come back who have been to A&E and they've come back and they're not testing them.
Do you feel like you're getting the support you need?
Not particularly, no.
Some residents are staying positive, even while separated from family.
Nobody knows how quick it's going to go away, and I think it's going to take a long time.
What's your plan when you finally get to see your family again?
We'll have several gin and tonics and say hooray.
Optimism, despite real concern for society's most vulnerable and those who are trying to protect them. Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
Now, as countries around the world count the cost of the coronavirus pandemic in human lives and economic damage, there is increased pressure on governments to ease some of the restrictions in place. In the UK, the government is warning that the country is still not past the peak of the coronavirus emergency and that the number of deaths is expected to increase further this week before they may start to plateau. We will have updates from the UK in a moment, but first of all, let's go to the United States, where the number of coronavirus deaths in the state of New York has risen to more than 10,000. That's almost half of all the deaths so far across the country. Well, this is the latest from New York's Governor, Andrew Cuomo.
There is going to be no morning where the headline says, hallelujah, it's over. That's not going to happen. But, yes, I think you can say the worst is over, because the worst here are people dying. That's the worst. The worst doesn't get any bad than this worst. And this worst is people die. That's the worst.
New York's governor there, Andrew Cuomo, giving a briefing update. Watching that briefing has been Anthony Zerka, who joins us live from Washington. And Andrew Cuomo, so many come to him and listen to his daily briefings. He's very straight talking when it comes to the situation in New York State.
Yes, and I think he was trying to strike a balance there by saying that it does look like the number of fatalities in New York State and in New York City itself has peaked and has started to go down. Same with the number of hospitalizations. But the reality is that people are still dying, and a peak does not mean an end to the deaths, end to the serious medical conditions. It just means they're going to start to decline. And then attention is going to have to turn on how to start to reopen some of these businesses and how to readjust, keeping in mind that if you do it too quickly, you could see another peak at some point down the line. That part of the reason why things have been plateauing in New York and across the country is because of the steps being taken.
And Anthony, we've been hearing previously of how states have been competing against each other when it comes to buying things like PPE. Now, at the moment, a number of states on the West Coast have come together in some sort of agreement. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Right, it was something that was just announced by Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, that he is going to be working with California and Oregon, these West Coast states, in order to not only agree on purchasing PPEs and ventilators and things like that, but also how and when to reopen their business as well, how to ease back on these shelter-in-place restrictions that keep people from leaving their homes and close all non-essential businesses. You actually heard that from Andrew Cuomo as well, working with East Coast states. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the way the United States has responded to this crisis, is that governors, the heads of the local individual states, have been by and large taking a lead on closing down businesses, taking steps to address the spread of the virus, and they also are planning on taking a lead in when to reopen businesses. On the other hand, you do hear from Donald Trump and the federal government. Donald Trump says it's the federal government's power to say when businesses are going to reopen, when businesses can get back to normal across the United States. And he's forming his own commission with his daughter Ivanka Trump and others on it that is going to be proposing ways to do that too. So it's almost as if there are competing voices right now on how to do that.
For those who are frustrated by the extended lockdowns across the world, even a hint of a path back to some kind of normal life would be something to celebrate. However, the World Health Organization has today issued this warning on the lifting of restrictions too soon.
We know that in some countries, cases are doubling every 3 to 4 days. However, while COVID-19 accelerates very fast, it decelerates much more slowly. In other words, the way down is much slower than the way up.
Yeah, so a stark reminder there from the WHO. The British government says that the UK is still going through the peak of its crisis. The official death toll rose by more than 700 people today. So this now takes the overall figure to more than 11,000 in the UK. And if you have a look at these graphs, these show the growth in number of daily deaths. And you can see that the UK's curve is on a similar track to Italy's. Well, here's the UK's government chief scientific advisor on this.
We're tracking behind Italy. We're following the same sort of path. What do I expect to see happen?
I think this week's difficult. I think this week we're going to see a further increase. Thereafter, we should see a plateau as the effects of the social distancing come through. That plateau may last for some time and then begin to decrease.
So that's from the daily briefing that we have in the UK. It is worth remembering that the UK had, in fact, more time to prepare than Italy's government. Italy recorded its 50th death on the 22nd of February. The UK reached that same point on March the 3rd, so 10 days later. Now, some experts and also journalists are starting to question what the UK could have done differently. Well, here's one exchange from today's briefing.
If you look at some of the countries that acted much sooner than the UK, South Korea in particular, only had a fraction of the deaths that we've seen in the UK. Isn't it clear that had we acted sooner, days or even weeks earlier than we did, that it would have made a difference in terms of lives lost?
I don't think it is clear. I don't think those comparisons are like for like because of where we are on the curve, as Sir Patrick has mentioned, but also the individual circumstance in those countries. But we will continue to monitor, and we do monitor what's going on in other countries and make sure we feed that into what we're doing here. Patrick, I don't know if there's anything else you'd add to that.
No, I think it's very difficult to make those comparisons, and as I say, we'll be able to look and see this in due course. I think there's a lot to learn from other countries in terms of what we need to do, and we're definitely looking very closely at other countries in terms of how they think about release of lockdown measures.
Well, one country that we often quote is Germany. It's another European country with a diverse economy, a big population, and also clusters of high density. The number of deaths there, however, currently stands at just over 3,000. Now, Germany conducted lots of testing and contract tracing from the very outset, and the latest figures show that Germany has now carried out 1.3 million tests in total, compared to that to the UK, which has conducted just 335,000. So here's the UK's Foreign Secretary again.
I know it's difficult when you look at the death toll and those figures, but we are seeing signs of tentative signs of a flattening out, and that was the original plan.
France has extended its lockdown until the 11th of May, but after that, schools will begin to reopen. President Emmanuel Macron has delivered this televised address.
From the 11th of May, schools, nurseries and sixth form schools will start to open, because for me it is a priority, as the inequalities are being more and more brought out. Children who are in poor areas or in the countryside that can't go to school, that don't have access to internet or telecommunication, don't have a complete living this differently. Within this period, inequalities between families are more and more marked. It's why these children need to find a journey to get to school. The government will put in special rules. Time will be organised and space will be organised differently. Children and teachers will be protected with the right equipment.
Well, our correspondent in Paris, Hugh Schofield, was monitoring the president's address.
What I was slightly surprised by was the detail with which he then started sketching out the post-11th of May world. I was kind of expecting him to say 11th of May and then maybe more, but he does seem to be indicating that 11th of May is going to be a key moment at which France begins its process of deconfinement. He said, for example, that from the 11th of May, schools and creches and universities will start to reopen, which is going to be a big change because that'll be 2 months. He said that other sectors of the economy should be allowed to start to reopen. Though at the same time, places where people gather together, like cafes, bars, restaurants, will remain shut. So he's, without getting into great detail, he is sort of indicating to the French that the 11th of May will be a key moment, which is the beginning of a new phase in this whole saga, and that it's not going to be just another date which will be pushed back once again.
Hugh Schofield reporting from Paris. Now, as countries around the world struggle to get the coronavirus outbreak under control, world powers have entered a ruthless competition for medical supplies. Some governments have been accused of medical piracy, basically hijacking shipments of crucial equipment which were intended for elsewhere. Earlier this month, Berlin accused the US of confiscating a shipment of 200,000 protective masks. They were being sent to Germany by a US company. Meanwhile, officials in France also accused American buyers of using cash to purchase shipments of masks which were destined for France, paying 3 times the original price. Well, the UK government denies involvement in all of these incidents. I asked Prashant Yadav, an expert in global health supply chains, why these alleged events are taking place.
While businesses and scientists are collaborating across borders and thinking about how to deliver the best science, governments across the globe are engaging in a zero-sum mentality where they're thinking, if I can get these supplies for my own national needs, for my own national stockpiles, then I will benefit the most. And in doing so, what we are forgetting is that there isn't truly a zero-sum mentality. If we try to get one supplies and block it, we would then not be able to get reciprocity on other supplies that we need. And our end game here is to try and get more supplies, both for populations within the country, but also populations globally, including those who live in low and middle income countries.
And as we see coronavirus affecting, say, certain groups more than others, are we going to see developing countries being affected more by this specific situation, in the fact that they will simply not be able to get the kit, the equipment that they need?
So I think it's worth thinking about separate categories of equipment. So personal protective equipment, which developing countries will start needing, for their preparedness plans, even before infection scenarios become more aggressive. That's an area where I think many developing countries are struggling. And the World Health Organization and other global agencies are helping multiple countries to come together and say, we will try and negotiate these supplies on your behalf. The key question is that even some of the low and middle income countries themselves are engaging in restricting exports. So then it becomes harder for the global agencies to make the case to developed country governments and others that some portion of the supplies need to be reserved and allocated for low and middle income countries. So I think it's a very difficult dynamic.
Italy has become the second country to register more than 20,000 coronavirus deaths after the United States. Another 566 deaths were recorded in the most recent 24-hour period. This figure is just over half as many as 2 weeks ago. And Italy is now gradually lifting its lockdown restrictions and will allow a few companies to resume operations on Tuesday. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Spanish Health Ministry says that 517 people have died in the past 24 hours, which is 100 fewer than the day before. The total number of people to have died from COVID-19 in Spain is 17,500. Some restrictions there have started to relax as well. Well, Damien McGuinness has more on the situation across Europe.
The numbers here are still incredibly high, because in Italy and Spain, which are the two countries worst hit by the coronavirus pandemic here in Europe, we have confirmed cases of more than 150,000 in each country. And in Italy, 20,000 deaths, more or less. In Spain, we're talking about 17,000 deaths. So these are really high numbers. What is causing the beginnings of hope, though, is that the daily death toll is starting to go down. So what that means is that the total numbers are still increasing, but that increase is less than it was just a week or two ago. So when you look at the daily death toll, now we're talking about numbers that are at some points less than 500 per day. Just a week ago, we were over 900 deaths a day. So although the situation is still very severe in both Italy and Spain, it is starting to improve. That's the hope anyway. And that's why governments in both countries are really trying to get the economy going again. Because on the one hand, you have this health emergency. On the other, you have an economic emergency that's brewing, because both countries are in a state of economic lockdown. So what we're seeing in Spain today, as you said earlier, manufacturing and construction workers are going back to work. This is really to get the economy going. At the same time, though, the lockdown itself for most people is still in place. So for most ordinary people, they won't see much of a difference, because you're still not allowed to go out unless it's strictly necessary, and most shops will still be closed. And I think any return to normal is going to take a long time, because it's about getting that balance between getting the economy going while not sparking another outbreak of the pandemic.
Yes, that crucial balance that so many countries are trying to maintain. Now, Russia, also a difficult day. It's reported its biggest daily increase in coronavirus cases so far, 2,500 new infections. The country has declared more than 18,000 cases and 148 people have lost their lives. Now, police checkpoints have been set up on roads around Moscow, and this is to ensure that only residents enter the Russian capital and that they have a valid reason to do so. Meanwhile, China has also stepped up controls around its northeastern border with Russia, which has now emerged as its new front line for coronavirus infections. Well, here's our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg.
These figures are still relatively low. I mean, in America, you've got, 560,000 confirmed cases compared to Russia's 18,000. But it's important to say that just a few days ago, the Moscow mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, made it clear that the peak in Russia was a long way away. He said that Russia was basically in the foothills of this pandemic. So there is a concern that the situation here is going to get far worse. And already there are reports that the health system in Moscow is feeling the pressure under enormous strain. President Putin's spokesman just a few days ago said the situation in Moscow hospitals was extremely tense. He talked about the heroism of Russian doctors. And interestingly, yesterday, Russian state TV, which normally paints quite a rosy picture of events of the situation in Russia, well, they showed a Russian doctor who said basically his hospital couldn't cope, that they only had 13,000 beds and 1,300 beds and 1,500 patients. So there is a sense here that the situation is getting worse.
Steve Rosenberg with the latest there from Moscow. Well, let's turn from Russia to neighbouring Belarus, where despite the warnings, over 1,000 soccer fans attended a football game in Brest. Well, this is the crowd at yesterday's game. And in fact, the Belarusian Premier League is the only place in Europe where football is still being played. And people from around the world have been tuning in to get their football fix. Although there were fans at the game, as we saw, many other fans decided to sensibly stay away. They filled the stands in a much safer way by buying virtual tickets online. In return, well, you can see they get their photos of their faces stuck on dummies sitting inside the stadium, almost as good as the real thing. Now, countries in Asia where COVID-19 first spread more than 3 months ago have taken different approaches to controlling this pandemic. In Singapore, which was successful in keeping cases down at the beginning, 386 new cases have just been confirmed. This is the highest number of cases in a single day so far. We're going to take you to our correspondent in Singapore and also in South Korea and Japan. But first of all, let's go to China, where the outbreak began. Here's Stephen McDonald in Beijing.
China's most strict lockdown has been in Hubei province. However, in most of the country, staying indoors has simply been a suggestion which people have followed. Now it's a cautious road to normality. You need to pass green phone app health clearance to buy train tickets. Neighbourhoods, apartment blocks are still only admitting residents. Restaurants are capping diner numbers. You can't sit too close to others. China is returning to work while guarding against a new wave of infections from citizens returning from overseas.
Here in South Korea, there has been no lockdown, no mandatory restrictions, despite over 10,000 people becoming infected. Instead, the government urged common sense. Stay apart where possible, work from home and avoid mass gatherings. And instead of controlling the movement of the population, it has aggressively traced and tested for the virus.
Silent streets and empty offices. Here in Singapore, a partial lockdown has kicked in over the last few days because of a second wave of infections. We're not meant to leave our homes anymore unless it's for one of 12 government-mandated reasons. Break those rules and you face fines, or worse, prison time. These measures are in place till the end of the month, but they could be extended if the virus isn't contained.
Here in Japan, most of us, at least in the biggest cities, are now living under a state of emergency. So what does that mean? Well, it means the government is asking people to stay at home at the weekends and in the evenings. And as you can see, most people are now complying with that. But this is not a lockdown. Offices remain open, so do pubs and restaurants until 8 o'clock in the evening. You can even go and get a haircut if you want to. The Japanese government appears determined to keep the economy going come what may.
And Japan is also not carrying out widespread testing. Instead, the government is hoping these limited measures will start to bend the curve of the epidemic downwards in the next 2 weeks or so. Will it work? We're going to have to wait and see. As you've seen from my colleagues around the region, governments here in Asia are using very different strategies to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. But one thing is very striking. Compared to America and Europe, the number of people dying in Asia from the coronavirus appears to be much, much lower. There's lots of speculation why that might be. Is it because people in Asia wear face masks much more? The truth is, right now, we simply don't know.
Well, the pandemic is also having a devastating effect on the economy. According to the latest predictions from the independent tax and spending watchdog, the OBR, that is the Office for Budget Responsibility. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, speaking at the daily Downing Street news conference, said he was deeply troubled by the figures. The OBR warns that if the lockdown lasts 3 months, with another 3 months, let's say, of partial lifting, the UK economy could shrink by 35% between April and June this year, before a likely recovery, they say. In the model, experts predicted unemployment could rise to 10% of the working population. That would be more than double the current unemployment levels and amount to a rise of 2 million jobless people. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, picks up the analysis.
Stuck on the shelf, stuck without trade. The shutdown's draining life from Chris Norcott's cider business, from the whole economy too.
We have a warehouse full of cider that we cannot sell, and we are funding the short-through through internet orders that come through into our business from our website. This is currently our only source of income.
Coronavirus presenting the government not just with a health emergency, but a decades-defining downturn.
These are tough times, and there will be more to come. But we came into this crisis with a fundamentally sound economy.
People are, of course, devastated by the numbers of people losing their lives, but tonight, with warnings of 2 million extra people unemployed, people are also desperately worried about their jobs. If you can level with people, do you think we will be feeling the costs of this crisis for a generation?
I also, when I see these numbers, deeply troubled. And as I've, I think, consistently said when I've been at this podium and elsewhere, this is going to be hard. Our economy is going to take a significant hit. And as I've said before, that's not an abstract thing. People are going to feel that in their jobs and in their household incomes. Your point about a generation, no, I very much hope that the measures we've put in place will allow us to do exactly as the OBR have said, bounce back.
When the shutters roll up, the car parks fill again and the closed signs flip back over, the report suggests the economy could recover fast. But with 2 million extra people potentially out of work, Labour fears today's predictions.
Unfortunately, they are quite a good reflection of the situation we're likely to find ourselves in. But of course, this really is down to the measures that can be put in place to sustain businesses and jobs. They are absolutely critical, not just now, but for the future health of our economy.
These numbers are well-informed guesses, not final, not inked in. But the direction is clear, and this virus is dragging the economy down. Jobs are being lost, and the national income is shrinking. And that affects not just how ministers balance lifting restrictions in the weeks and months to come, but what governments can and can't pay for in future, how much they borrow, and how much tax we pay.
People say I capture the essence of those personalities.
Rebecca Douglas's wedding photography business has disappeared for now.
I've been employed since I was 13. I'm now 36. I don't know what it's like to not work. So I think as an entrepreneur, there are ways in which you're sort of soul searching and trying to find a route through, where perhaps it feels quite unfair.
She's trying to find ways through. The job for so many of us. The job for the country too. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News.
Well, the potential damage to the economy is not just a short-term threat. There will certainly be a longer-term impact as well. Our economics editor, Faisal Islam, has been looking in more detail at the latest forecasts.
A month down the road, and still surreal scenes of a closed country. The cogs of the economy paused to give space to protect public health. But it's not without its own cost, and today the government's own internal forecaster set out what that could be if these scenes last for a further 2 months. The numbers are huge, Britain's economy could shrink by 13% in 2020 in the case of a 3-month coronavirus lockdown. That would be a far larger contraction than seen during the financial crisis over a decade ago, the world wars, and the only precedent is the Depression of 1920 to 21. Although there is a bounce back, it won't be, under their scenario, until next year. This means permanent damage and government borrowing at 14% of the size of the economy, the highest since World War II.
If you were to see the sort of decline in GDP that we think would be consistent with a 3-month lockdown, then you wouldn't have seen a quarterly fall in the economy like that in living memory. The hope, though, is that that is going to be a temporary rather than a permanent problem, and that we don't end up scarring the long-term potential of the economy.
These scenarios are worse than the gloomy global forecasts of the International Monetary Fund.
This is something that we haven't seen any of our lifetimes. The last crisis was the major crisis, was the global financial crisis. At that time, the global economy shrunk by 0.1%, so it was negative 0.1%. Right now, in our baseline, we're talking about growth at negative 3%. So this is the worst since the Great Depression.
So no surprise that shutting down hits the economy hard, but the sheer magnitude of the hit is shocking. This is what the shutdown looks like in real life at an industrial park. The furniture manufacturers closed, the cranes over there idle, the freight distributors shut, the brewing depot not working either. Why? To protect public health, to protect the NHS. So there was a trade-off going into this. Does the same trade-off exist coming out of this? Lift the lockdown to boost the economy? It isn't quite as simple as that. One of Britain's top medicines companies, AstraZeneca, is helping ramp up testing, but the boss says the absence of vaccines and cures has consequences for a return to normality.
We have to balance, of course, saving as many lives as possible, but also return to a normal life and restart the economy, because a lot of misery and problems is now generated with so many people losing jobs, etc.
It's not going to be a few weeks, is it? It's going to be months, maybe longer.
If we all do a good job working together, we could get there. My hope is that we'll move out of this acute phase into a more chronic situation. A more chronic situation will have lower number of cases that you can manage.
In the absence of a vaccine, even with a massive economic hit, it won't be as simple as just lifting the lockdown.
Well, let's go live to the Treasury in Whitehall, and Faisal is there for us tonight. Faisal, in your report you mentioned the sheer magnitude of the hit that we're talking about here. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, these are staggering numbers that the people that work at this institution would never have imagined seeing on a chart about the British economy in their lifetimes. 2 months ago, a fall of 1/3% over 3 months would have been seen as pretty bad. This is about 1/3 of the entire economy. And yes, there is a bounce back, but the overall impact over the course of the year is an economy about 1/7 smaller, with consequences for jobs, consequences for public borrowing too. And so it's important that even these grim numbers, underlying that is a strong bounce back. In order to get that, you need to get the Treasury's rescue money out into the economy. You need to get some sort of handle over the health crisis, and you need to provide confidence to workers and consumers. You won't get that if the lockdown's lifted prematurely.
Faisal, thanks very much indeed. Again, at the Treasury, Faisal Islam, our economics editor.
Every day there's a new frontline in the fight against COVID-19. This outbreak is seemingly unrelenting, and many countries that had appeared to slow down the transmission of coronavirus are now facing the prospect of a second wave of infections. In Suifenhe, a Chinese town bordering Russia, medics are preparing for cases to increase sharply and are taking precautions.
When the door is closed, it becomes a confined space, and this machine will extract air. This is called negative pressure.
Chinese cities near the border with Russia are tightening restrictions. Strict border controls are now a reality for almost every corner of the world. Experts say the only chance of life returning to normal is a vaccine, and authorities in Beijing say they've now approved clinical testing for 3 vaccines and are working swiftly to make them a reality.
We will make efforts to do a good job in developing these vaccines so they can be used as quickly as possible.
Like China in the US, the first human trial of a vaccine has also skipped animal testing, but experts say that could be risky.
When you've got so many people working on so many different vaccines, everyone's going to be competing to say theirs is going to be the best. And if you rush a vaccine too much and you get side effects, then that's going to have a really deleterious effect.
While trials are happening at a rapid pace, the World Health Organization says the vaccine is at least 12 to 18 months away. Jessica Washington, Al Jazeera.
And joining us now, Delaware Governor John Carney, who is part of the group of East Coast governors teaming up to coordinate just when and how to go about reopening. Thanks so much for joining us, Governor.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's good to be with you.
And as you've heard, President Trump says that he has the ultimate authority on reopening states. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, now's not the time to have an argument or fight with the President of the United States and our partners at the federal government. Now is the time to work with our federal partners to sort out the future. First of all, to make sure that we're flattening our curve here in the state of Delaware, and we've got a state of emergency, a declaration in place with a stay-at-home order, with a traveling quarantine from people coming from out of our states. We've joined this coalition to help the governors think through how do we restart our economies, how do we have a rolling recovery, as people have referred to it. My good friend, the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, says it's not like flicking on a switch. It's more like a dimmer switch where we're going to move and open the economy gradually, and we'll be working together as part of that coalition. I was excited to join because I know we'll get access to the best thinking, the best science, and we'll base our decisions here on Delaware on the situation on the ground and the data and the science that's directing us.
Is it too early to talk about a timeline when that might happen for Delaware or in general along the East Coast?
Yeah, I do think it's way too early. You know, we're still seeing an increase in the number of positive cases, about 8% a day. Our hospitalization rate is a little bit lower than in other places across the country, and that's a good thing. It enables us to have hospital capacity, particularly for the most vulnerable populations, our senior citizens. But we're still seeing an increase in positive cases, an increase, although slower, in hospitalizations, and an increase, sadly, in deaths here in Delaware.
And as you say, we're having this conversation about reopening states as cases continue to rise, people continue to pass away. How do you walk that tightrope of balancing the economy and saving lives?
It's a very difficult decision. I think the decisions to open the economy back up are going to be even more difficult than the decisions to close it down, because it really is uncharted waters. At what point in the curve do you start turning on that dimmer switch and start opening up businesses? I hear the anguish in the small business owners on the phone that I talk to all the time, the fear that they're going to lose their business. I hear the anguish from people that are unemployed and want to go back to work. But we have to have a healthy community before we can have a healthy economy again. And it's not a false choice. We have to have both, but they have to be sequential. We have to have a healthier community and then be able to start turning on the economy and getting a stronger economy again. And that's really the challenge before us. And we really need to work together as governors here in this region, working with our federal partners and the White House Task Force as well.
Until there's a vaccine, are you worried that the virus could come back in the fall, say, and Delaware and other states would have to go through this all over again? I mean, essentially, is there a way without a vaccine for people to try to go back to normal?
I am worried about that, and I'm worried about turning that light switch on a little bit too quickly and having what I've heard referred to as a rebound. We certainly don't want that. You know, ideally, we don't want to turn the economy back on a day too soon or a day too late. Meeting that happy medium is going to be really challenging, and that's why doing it and making those decisions with the other governors in our region, led by Governor Cuomo, who's really had the most difficult situation there in New York, and our thoughts and prayers are with him every day. But our other states in that region and here in the greater Philadelphia region, in the lower part of our state, there on the shore, have a different situation, and we'll make decisions here based on the facts on the ground, but with the help and assistance and guidance of that coalition.
A lot of people around across the country have homes on Airbnb. Delaware, for example, is a state that has a large amount of second homes on the beach. And with the summer rental season approaching, do you anticipate allowing people to rent out their homes? And what about businesses that rely on so many tourists?
Yeah, well, right now we've shut that down. It's one of the last things, the most recent things that we did, because it was creating a problem for us with people coming in. You know, we're a small little state, and we're bisected by the Interstate 95. That's the main corridor north and south here in the East Coast, and by the Amtrak Northeast corridor. And so we've got a lot of people coming across our border. And that's why it's important to work with the coalition to see if we can coordinate the reopening. So something is not open somewhere else, or open here where it's not open somewhere else. We have people streaming across our borders. We had that situation earlier in March around St. Patrick's Day with bars and restaurants, and with our beautiful beaches on a beautiful spring day that we had. And that's one of the reasons to coordinate with the other governors in the region.
Are you and the other governors open to working with additional states in order to come up with a cohesive plan?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do through the National Governors Association. Governor Hogan just over the line in Maryland. He's our chair, and he's doing a wonderful job leading our group. We have a couple calls a week on the conference call with the White House, with Vice President Pence and their team. We take the information that they provide us kind of on a national scale in terms of protective equipment, testing capacity, the science about recovery, and all of that. And so we use the experience in other states, the experience across the country, and the experts at the federal level for our response and for our decision making. And that's the way it should be.
Governor Carney, thank you so much for your time and insight tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.
Sources tell CNN that the Small Business Administration is telling lawmakers that stimulus money funding its special small business loan program will run out by the end of the week. Congress has not been able to agree on legislation to provide more funding. Democrats are insisting on provisions to get that money to more small businesses, as well as increased funding for states and hospitals. CNN's Phil Mattingly talked to some small business owners who desperately need the money to save jobs for their employees.
For more than 40 years, Kelly Conklin's architectural woodworking shop was a constant.
This one came with a swiftness and severity that I don't think anybody could prepare for.
Until coronavirus forced Conklin to close his doors.
What I think we need, and what I don't see coming yet, first, my business needs a direct cash infusion.
Conklin has furloughed his 13 employees. One has come down with the virus. The Emergency Small Business Lending Program in the $2 trillion stimulus could add weeks to his company's ability to survive. But more than a week after applying, he has heard nothing.
It's now going on a week, and crickets, nothing. I have no idea whether the application is correct. I have no idea whether we're going to be approved for this.
And the clock is ticking. CNN spoke to more than 24 small business owners, finding varying degrees of frustration, anger, and outright desperation, but also stories of business-saving success, each a reflection of a government trying to build a relief program unprecedented in scale. Just last year, the Small Business Administration handled 60,000 loan applications. In the last 2 weeks, they've approved more than 1 million. But lack of guidance and tech glitches hampered the experience for lenders and borrowers alike. Andrew and Brianna Volk did successfully receive money through the program, but now say they have more questions than answers.
It's almost a full-time job having to kind of figure out what's going on and, if we're doing everything correctly.
The main couple owns Portland Hunt and Alpine Club. They've laid off all but one of their employees and are now grappling with how exactly to use the new money they've received.
We're used to taking on risk. We're used to taking on and dealing with complex situations. But when the government is on the other side of the table and changing the rules on you on a daily basis, it's scary.
Still, with more than $240 billion of the $349 billion allocated for the program already committed, more money is now at the heart of a Washington political dispute. The urgent need underscoring that when the program works, it is literally saving businesses.
I really feel blessed.
Tim Miller has 4 employees at his auto repair shop in Owasso, Oklahoma. 4 employees he paid out of his own pocket as 98% of his revenue disappeared.
You know, I didn't want to see my people suffer.
But just 72 hours after he submitted his application, the government funds were in his account. For Miller, amid an economic and public health catastrophe, it means there's a little bit of something everyone could use right now.
Just relieved a lot of stress. I was able to tell my employees that we saved money as well. And so that really took a lot of stress off of them. And it just meant everything to get this money.
And Jake, lawmakers really have days to try and figure out how to find a path forward for that additional funding. The next big test, the Senate will convene on Thursday. Republicans sticking to their position that they only want to deal with money for the small business program. Democrats haven't budged off theirs as well. One thing is clear, however, when this program works, it does save small businesses, and small businesses right now need the money more than anybody else. So the real question is, can lawmakers reach agreement to give more money as the SBA is very quickly running out of funds? Jake?
The numbers behind this story are very grim, and increasingly we're learning they may be telling an incomplete story. Now, the Office for National Statistics reports the number of recorded deaths every week. For the latest week recorded, the 14th week in the year, up till April the 3rd, 16,387 people have died. Now, while not all of those were COVID deaths, if you need any further evidence of the severity of this crisis, just look at how that compares to the weekly deaths so far this year. The bars there show every week back to January, and the line shows the 5-year rolling average. That latest bar is a huge jump, and it's actually the highest weekly total since the ONS started compiling this data all the way back in 2005. Now, 21.2% of those deaths had COVID-19 mentioned on the death certificate. Let's compare the total number of deaths to those released by the Department for Health and Social Care at the time. You can see while the trend is very similar, there is that big gap there between those two lines. Now, according to the ONS, there were 6,235 deaths in England and Wales by April the 3rd. But at the time, that lower line there, the government only reported just over 4,000. So why this big gap, and what does it tell us? Well, firstly, it demonstrates the delay in reporting, but also it tells us something about the gaps in the government numbers. If we take, for example, the deaths registered by April the 3rd, 4,122. Just 90% of those happened in hospital, leaving 10%, 406 there to be exact, that happened in the community. Now, 217 of those deaths were in care homes, 136 happened within people's homes, 33 were in hospices, 3 were in other communal places, and 17 were described as having happened elsewhere. So far, only hospital deaths have been included in the government numbers. Now, if we bring back that first column that showed the latest weekly death numbers, the concern here is not just those COVID deaths that have caused the jump in those numbers above that 5-year average, but it's also the other deaths. There's a chance that some of those extra deaths there could have happened as an indirect result of the pandemic, perhaps people not presenting at hospital when they should be. As the crisis continues, sadly, we may not have seen the worst of its effects.
The International Monetary Fund says the coronavirus pandemic will cost the world's economies $9 trillion over the next 2 years. The warning comes as countries around the world face prolonged lockdowns as they try to contain the outbreak. The IMF's chief economist says it is the worst economic shock since the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Flattening the spread of COVID-19 using lockdowns allows health systems to cope with this crisis, which then permits a resumption of economic activity. In this sense, there is no trade-off between saving lives and saving livelihoods. Countries should continue to generously support their health systems, perform widespread testing, and refrain from trade restrictions on medical supplies. A global effort must ensure that when therapies and vaccines are developed, both rich and poor nations alike have immediate access.
Our correspondent Alan Fisher tracking this story for us this hour on the News Hour. So, Alan, this will be focusing minds when it comes to finance ministers around the world.
It is a pretty stark assessment from the International Monetary Fund that the global economy will essentially contract by 3% in the first quarter, and they're hoping that in the second half of the year things will improve. But they admit that that might not be the case. If the situation gets worse, if the lockdowns continue, then this just might be the brighter side of the economic forecast. Of course, there is always the opportunity that things could actually get better, and certainly they believe that may well happen if there is to be a recovery in 2021, saying that in that time we could see the whole global economy rebounding by about 5.8%, but it will be slow and it will be patchy because different countries will come out of this at different points. Talking about how it impacts various parts of the world, in the United States you're talking about a loss of 5.9% in the economy. In Europe, where they use the euro, so excluding the UK, 5.7%. In Japan, down by 5.2%. And China, growth of just 1%. Now, it looks as if China is getting out of this quite well, but when you consider that last year they reported growth of 6%, you can see just how severely that has hit their economy. What the IMF says is that when all this is done, you have to get away from the idea of deglobalization because that won't help the global economy. And also, there has to be fiscal stimulus across several countries. It has to be coordinated. It can't just be piecemeal. And they say in that way, that could rebuild the global economy by 2021. But as I say, a stark assessment from the International Monetary Fund.
And as far as the US economy is concerned, specifically, Alan, where you are, Donald Trump is saying, look, I am the guy who can or will choose not to restart the economy when the time is right. Other people saying, no, it has to happen in stages. And on top of that, you had claims for 17 million people putting in claims for Social Security in the States in the space of 3 weeks. And that's never happened before, ever in the US.
No, Donald Trump, to be clear, Donald Trump doesn't have the power to order states to reopen. What he can do is put a great deal of pressure on a number of states, a number of governors, and say, look, you have to do this. But he doesn't have the power to reopen the economy. And many states are very much in line with public thinking in this, which is we will reopen when the scientists say it's safe. Now, there are a number of organizations who are tied to Donald Trump's re-election effort, who would be regarded in this country as right-wing, who are saying that they are going to start organising protests demanding that the economy be reopened. And it may well be there is a gradual reopening, but you'll remember that Donald Trump was talking about having the economy up and running again by Easter. Well, that was last Sunday. He's now talking about May the 1st. That seems unlikely when a number of states are saying that their peak is still 2 weeks away. So that would take us towards that date. This is going to be a long, slow process. And you have to see it through Donald Trump's eyes. He sees it through the prism of if there is a strong economy, then he will be re-elected. That's what he believes. That is what his campaign has been building on. And that is what been building up to the point when the virus hit. And he thinks if this continues, then the economy will be wrecked. He will get the blame and therefore he won't be re-elected. That is why he is very keen to reopen the economy as soon as possible. But looking at the figures from the IMF and what Donald Trump is saying, it seems unlikely that in the second quarter, which would take us through to June, for those who don't speak financial talk, which would take us to the end of June, they're saying that this is going to impact the global economy and it's going to impact the United States. And it could well go on for a period after that as well.
Alan, thanks very much. Let's bring in Gareth Leather. He's a senior economist at Capital Economics, a consultancy in London. Gareth, welcome back to Al Jazeera. These numbers are staggering. What do they mean?
They are unprecedented, and I think that is because the economic shock that we're facing now is unprecedented. That large parts of the global economy are effectively shut down to contain the spread of the coronavirus. And until health officials and governments are confident that the virus has been contained, these measures will remain in place and the economic shock will continue.
We're seeing some economies begin just to loosen the strictures inside which they've been operating lockdowns or partial lockdowns or near lockdowns. Will the easing of those economic stays, if you will, go any way to mitigate the staggering figures that we're discussing from the IMF?
I think they will. So what you'll probably see is that the global economy probably shrink maybe 10% this quarter, but as the shutdowns are unlocked, you will initially at least get a very strong rebound as shops and factories are reopened. But I think then the global economy will start to face a number of headwinds in the form of very weak demand, that lots of companies have gone bust through this, unemployment is a lot higher, and all of that will drag on global growth as well. Some sectors, for example, most notably tourism, are going to take a very long time indeed to recover.
And when you talk about that kind of knock-on effect, a domino effect, almost, say, 6 or 12 months down the line, you know, we've seen, say, in the past 24 hours, people returning to industries like the building trade. That's good. They're making money again. People are building houses. But no one's going to build the house, nobody's going to buy the houses, rather, because they can't get a mortgage because they've lost their jobs.
No, exactly. So you will get this initial bounce back in economic activity as shops and so on are opened up. But straight after that, I think you're going to run into a lot of headwinds in terms of the kind of the drag that's going to come from all of the big shock that's happened over the past quarter in terms of bankruptcies, in terms of lost jobs. And that is going to weigh quite heavily on demand. And that is why governments and central banks have been stepping up stimulus to try and give the economy this extra boost when it comes out of this shock that's been induced by these shutdowns.
What form will that stimulus take?
Well, it's multiform. So central banks have cut interest rates, and in places where interest rates are now zero, they've introduced quantitative easing. Governments have also been loosening fiscal policies. So in some countries, it's in the form of cash giveaways to people. It's in the form of very cheap loans to companies to make sure that they can get through the crisis. But all this is really kind of disaster relief at the moment. It's to make sure that these companies can get through the crisis. I think in the third quarter, you'll need another boost from governments as well to provide that extra support to demand that's going to be lacking from the private sector because of unemployment and higher debt levels and so on.
Gareth Leather, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, as if that economic news wasn't bad enough, the world's airlines now stand to lose more than $300 billion in revenue this year. That's the latest forecast from IATA. That's the overall industry's representative body. Carriers of grounded aircraft and crew, of course, amid a growing number of travel restrictions and border closures. Let's go straight to our economics editor, Abid Ali, who joins us on Skype from London. Abid, great to have you here on the News Hour. This is kind of the blow that the airline industry was waiting on landing on top of it, wasn't it?
Peter, you're absolutely right. You know, the airline industry employs somewhere in the region of 65 million people, directly and indirectly. And so, you know, they're expecting 25 million jobs could be lost over the next 3 months unless governments step in with help. Now, we had in the United States that the Trump administration has said they'll give $60 billion to the airline industry. But the airline industry has been reluctant to take those on because part of that money comes in the form of loans. And quite rightly so, many people would think. And some of that money cannot be used to buy back shares or dividends or pay executives huge bonuses, as has been the case in the previous financial crisis in 2008. So they're reluctant to take the money. And when you look at, for instance, in the UK, the British government has said, listen, you know, we're not going to hand out huge bailouts to help the airlines, and we'll take each airline case by case and see what support we can offer. But the first port of call, you need to go to your shareholders to get your money. And you've got British Airways now, they're in the process of forlorning 30,000 employees. So this is very real economy kind of stuff. This is people's lives being affected. And you put this into the wider context because the global tourism industry is such a huge industry. It's about almost $9 trillion is the actual value of it. And it employs more than 300 people around the world. And it's not just airlines, it's hotels, it's cruise ships, and it's your Airbnbs. You know, the little guys are suffering as much as the big guys.
Okay, when we talk about the little guys and the big guys in the context of the airline industry, I noticed on Twitter, British Airways is scrapping 1747 per day, every day this week. So, my question is this. Will this directly impact the low-cost carriers, for whom the profit margins are very small, or the big legacy carriers, the British Airways, the American Airlines, the Qantas-type airline setup, you know, those big legacy carriers who've been around for 50, 60, 70 years?
So I think this is a very good, very interesting question to put. Now, here's the thing. British Airways has taken, and Qantas, they've taken lessons from the low-cost airlines. And so they've been reducing their costs. You know, when you go onto an aeroplane, you know, they'll be giving you a sandwich rather than a full meal. And they'll be reducing other costs as well along the way. So, you know, you're paying for your baggage, just like you do for the low-cost airlines. This is going to hit all airlines. I don't think that, you know, this pandemic will discriminate as to, you know, who gets affected the most. So all airlines will need some kind of funding or will need some kind of borrowing to get them through this particular process. In the US, for instance, if small airlines are borrowing under $100 million, they don't have to abide by the rules which say, you know, you can't use this money for anything else like dividends or whatever. This is money for you to keep people in jobs. And so I think you're going to see the same kind of support around the world from governments to airlines, which will be specific to say, this money that we give you is entirely for keeping people in work, and anything else, you need to go to your shareholders to find the money.
Abid, thanks very much.